Let's do it. Absolutely. I did see one person in the chat mentioning they seem to have lost audio, but no other people are saying they have it. So please chime in if anybody's having problems. But yeah, I'll go ahead and dive right in. I am really excited to be with you all here today. As Chris mentioned, my background is I was an Air Force instructor pilot for about a decade. Then I went over to SpaceX, hence the space theme of a lot of what I talk about. And I'm really excited about this topic today and kind of the particular way that I like to approach leadership development now. It's especially since we have such a experienced audience. It's likely not going to be anything like super new or groundbreaking. Often what I find I like to do in a lot of the speaking that I give is that you all already know a lot of this stuff, but very often when it comes to good learning, what it is this just about a reminder of the basics that we all have learned as we were growing up. We learned in school, we learned wherever we learned it, but we just kind of lose our way every now and then or forget about some of that stuff. And so today's presentation for some of you might be kind of a reminder of the basics, but I guarantee you it's going to be a new way of looking at things. And I don't know about all of you, but I was really excited when I saw the topic, of the theme of the conference of getting back to be human centered, because many of you have probably experienced this. This is a screenshot that I grabbed from Google Trends of just the search history of the term AI over the past few years, right? And, it is the thing that everyone is talking about. It's hard to have a conversation about kind of anything, but especially in learning without AI coming up. And so I think it's really important to take a step back sometimes, though it's going to be an incredibly disruptive technology. It's doing so much for our field and for a lot of fields, reminding ourselves that the point of all of this stuff is still us, the people who are at the core of all of our learning experiences, is really important. And that's why I'm really excited about the topic that I have today, because at least the story that I'm going to tell, the way I'm going to tell it, is really about taking learnings from a very high technical field, a very technical centric field, and applying it to a people centric, a human centric topic, which is learning and development. So today, I'm going to first start by talking about kind of defining what first principles design is, using a very specific example from my background in space. Then we're going to kind of dissect that a little bit about, okay, so if we know what first principles are, how do we apply that to learning and to leadership development? And then look at a very specific example of applying it within leadership development. So what are first principles? How do I describe first principles? Well, I'm going to use a story from my background, which is my time at SpaceX and basically my time in rocketry. Okay, so at a big picture level, first principles thinking is different than what we often do. Often we start by doing everything of reasoning by analogy. That's often how we kind of make our way through the world, because it's usually an easier way to make sense of the world. And what reasoning by analogy is you're just simply looking at the things that have come before you, looking at situations that are similar to what you've seen in the past, and kind of tweaking those solutions or those situations to your current situation. It's usually a lot easier, and it's honestly how our brains are wired, right? There's another talk I give a lot that kind of talks about how our brains are wired to assume, to jump to conclusions, essentially. That's where heuristics come in, that's where biases come in, and our brains are designed to use those biases because it's really a lot easier for our brains to think that way. It's a lot less energy intensive, and it's a lot faster for us to make decisions that way. So it makes sense that normally when we're walking through the world, reasoning by analogy makes a lot of sense. It gets us really far, but it can run into some limitations. And when we think about the truly groundbreaking technologies or the groundbreaking thinkers throughout history, the reason they are groundbreaking is because they don't use reasoning by analogy. They much more often use something called reasoning by first principles. And what reasoning by first principles is I'm going to kind of pretend that the past world doesn't exist, right? I don't know anything about it. I'm just going to look at my specific situation and try to deconstruct and identify the underlying constraints, the underlying assumptions of this specific situation. And that's how I'm going to build up my solution, kind of as if nothing had ever existed before, right? So let me give you that very concrete real world example that I was mentioning from space. So if you follow space, you may or may not know, this is the Delta IV Heavy rocket from United Launch Alliance here in the United States. It actually just retired. This rocket just flew for its final time, but for a very long time, it was kind of the workhorse large rocket for at least here in the United States. And one of the crazier things about this rocket is that it has heritage dating all the way back to the 1950s, right? So there was a rocket that some of the very first rockets that were being developed in the United States back in the late 1950s. One of those rockets was called the Thor Delta. And there's this great YouTube video on the history of Delta rockets and the history of Thor rockets put out by a guy named Scott Manley. And he kind of traces the heritage of that late 1950s Thor Delta rocket all the way up to today and this Delta IV Heavy. And this, in my opinion, is a great example of reasoning by analogy, because you have 70 years of heritage there of taking an existing rocket, having some new situation that you needed to solve, and just kind of tweaking it and adding something and making a variation. And let's make the fuel tanks a little bit longer. Let's make them a little bit wider. Let's try adding on a new engine. And so getting to the Delta IV Heavy, in my opinion, one way to look at it is 70 years of reasoning by analogy. And it got to this very impressive rocket that can do a whole lot of things. So this is kind of the pinnacle in space of how far can reasoning by analogy take you. It can take you a very long way. Let's look at another way to get to basically the same thing, because this is the Falcon Heavy rocket from SpaceX. As you can tell, it looks very similar, right? It's very similar in size. It is, let's be honest, a completely different rocket, but very similar size, very, very similar in capabilities to the Delta IV Heavy. But this is one where, so I learned first principles thinking from being my time at SpaceX and listening to people like Elon Musk. And SpaceX very much was, let's go back to the beginning. Let's forget about rockets that existed in the past. What if we just looked at the fundamental physics, the fundamental principles of the problems that we're trying to solve and build up from there? Famously, the whole reason SpaceX exists actually is way back in the early 2000s, Elon wanted to send a greenhouse to Mars. That's what he wanted to do, right? It was going to be basically a PR stunt where he wanted to have some iconic photo of like a green leaf with a red Martian background to kind of inspire all these people, like this new age of space exploration. And so he went shopping for rockets, and he went to Russia, since at the time Russia was selling lots of old ICBMs from the Cold War. And I forget exactly the number that they were charging him, but they were going to charge him like 50-60 million dollars for a relatively small rocket. And it blew his mind. It didn't make any sense to him. And as one example of true first principles thinking, he was kind of like, okay, like how much does like most of these rockets are made out of aluminum. How much does the actual physical aluminum in a rocket cost? Right? If you took the whole rocket and just smashed it down, you were left with a chunk of aluminum. It's probably like a few $1,000s worth of raw metal. How is it that if the raw components cost a couple hundred or a couple $1,000s, how is it all of a sudden ballooning to millions of dollars? Right? Like that's kind of the way that he was thinking about this. And so all of SpaceX is built on this perspective of let's forget what was done in the past and let's just try to do something new. So we now have two rockets, right, that are very similar in capability. One kind of built up over several decades using kind of a reasoning by analogy approach, and one built up much more recently using a reasoning by first principles. And the Delta IV Heavy costs about $350 million per launch to the U.S. customers like the U.S. government and NASA. Meanwhile, Falcon Heavy costs about $90 million. Right. So I think this is a great example of the power that first principles thinking can have, right? If you just get rid of the previous assumptions, get rid of the things that had gone before, and truly look at something through the lens of, okay, what are the requirements that we have to solve here? You can wind up with things that are far faster, far cheaper, far simpler in any way you want to kind of apply this type of thinking. So if you apply this to something like leadership development, a reasoning by analogy approach would have you asking a question like, what leadership programs have I done in the past that I really liked? Very often I'll be talking with folks and, they did life labs at they used life labs at their last company. And so they're going to use life labs again. Nothing against life labs. It's just kind of, what popped into my head. And I think that's, we look to the kinds of programs that we have done in the past. And I think very often it's a constraint we put on ourselves because maybe it's, our leadership, our executives have something in their mind of like, this is what leadership development looks like. Leadership development is a 2-day offsite where we're all going to go out and we're all going to go do like big thinking things of talk about big words and big concepts. And the question is like, is that effective? Right. I don't know. I mean, I would love for all of you, feel free to chime in the chat of which do you, is that honestly the most effective way to deliver any kind of learning, like it, right? Where it's like a one-time event where you just go in, you do the training, and then you magically expect everybody to be able to do the new thing after the 2 days. If I would guess that most of you have probably not had that experience being the most successful. And really, we all know that the more successful way to do it would be to, drip campaign the learning over several weeks or months or things like that. And so, reasoning by analogy is, what have I done in the past? What do my executives think? What have I liked before? Whereas a reasoning by first principles would forget anything that's happened in the past and say, what are the leadership challenges my organization is currently facing? Right? There's several questions that you could ask, but that's like one of those example questions, right? Where you just get rid of, you try to push aside what's been done in the past and you just look at what you're doing today. So let's dive a little bit deeper into this, right? Into this idea of first principles for leadership development. And, first principles in rocketry, it's founded by fundamental physics. That's always the question that you're trying to get back to and figure out what's the root assumption, what's the root constraint to what I'm trying to do. Well, what's the corollary of that if we're trying to talk about and apply first principles thinking to leadership development? Well, I think, like I said, in rockets, fundamental physics are fundamental physics, right? It's literally the physics. Very often in, a practical way, day to day, when an engineer is designing a rocket, that kind of turns into something like material properties, right? Like how strong is steel, that kind of stuff. So if we look at learning, in my opinion, our fundamental physics is really neuroscience, right? And I'm not well versed in neuroscience. I just kind of studied as a hobby. Highly recommend all of you go check out Lauren Waldman, the Learning Pirate. If you've never heard of her before, definitely look her up on LinkedIn, because she's kind of one of the leading experts of neuroscience in learning. As she's a learning professional who went and got learning science education. But when it comes to practical day to day, I think neuroscience kind of levels up to human action. That's the thing that we really need to think about ourselves in terms of when I'm designing learning. Human action is the thing that I'm designing for and is my primary constraint. What are people doing day to day? What are the things that are making people better leaders or worse leaders? It's actually human actions that we really want to, concern ourselves about. And so I want to, when I say human action or human behavior, I want to tell you what I mean with a little bit of a story about a guy named Alex Hormozi. Shout out, raise your hand or something if you've ever heard of Alex Hormozi. If you haven't, that's totally fine. He's kind of an entrepreneur influencer, at least here in the United States right now. And he tells this absolutely amazing story about how so he's an influencer. He's on YouTube a lot. So he has a videography team. He has all these different, producers. And he was sitting with his team one day realizing, okay, like I have one video producer on my team who just seems to be a whole lot better than the others, but I'm struggling to figure out why. Like, why is this person better than all the other people? And we've all experienced this in our life, right? Whether it's on our own teams or on other teams, you just know, like, certain people are more skilled than others. And so what they did is they had this really, the good videographer, the great videographer or producer, produce a video with him, and they had kind of like a third party observer watching the whole interaction and writing down every action that they saw them take throughout the filming process. And they compared that to the actions that the other people were taking, and they wrote down the most innocuous things, right? Like, one example would be the really great producer was, standing right behind the camera, like making eye contact with the person they were filming. And while they were back there, they were nodding their head, right? Like, they were really going like, yeah, this is great. This is great. Really getting into it, giving a lot of feedback to the person. And so it created this situation where there was like this feedback loop between the two of them, where, he's imitating like, this is really great. So then the speaker is like, oh, I'm really killing this. Like, this is really doing good. So he gets more excited, and it just builds the energy. And so they wrote down a list of simple things like that, right? Like, nod your head while the person's speaking. And they took that list and they gave it to the other producers. And sure enough, those other producers started getting better, right? They would start, okay, nod. Part of my checklist is nod your head. Okay, I'm gonna nod my head, right? Like, it was just a series of actions like that that made them better at their job because they had so closely defined the actions, right? And so, when we think about the kinds of things that we're thinking about, in that example, the outcome that they were trying to create was a better video producer. That's what they were trying. That's the outcome that they wanted. And so the actions that entailed, which is, again, the kind of like the fundamental physics, the thing that we're trying to play with when we're doing first principles thinking, is, stand behind the camera, look the subject in the eye, nod your head, right? So the outcome, better video producer. The actions, stand behind the camera, look the subject in the eye, nod your head as you're going through it. So if we think about that for us, an outcome that I want might be give better feedback. So then we say, oh, okay, the actions are ask them if you can give them feedback, right? Like, that's a simple action. You can just say, hey, remember to say, hey, can I give you some feedback? That's a simple action that you can build into your workshops to practice again and again. Describe the action that you're giving feedback on. Tell them the impact of the action. In my opinion, when we're talking about breaking things down to like first principles, this is the level that I want to break them down to, of trying to describe the very discrete actions that I want people to take. And this, I will say, this is where I have gotten pushback in the past because people think it's really, really awkward, right? Like, I think most of us have probably been in some kind of, listening training, you're training on how to be an active listener. And whenever you're taking training on how to be an active listener, they kind of do this. And one of the things that they tell you to always do is, whenever the person you're listening to finishes speaking, what do you finish with? You always say, so what I hear you saying is, right? Like, that's the phrase. So what I hear you saying is, and I've had HR professionals who say, look, like, that's just not realistic. Like, that just sounds super awkward. Nobody actually says that in a conversation. Like, come on, what are you talking about here? And so one thing I will say, because I do somewhat agree with that, is when we break it down to these discrete actions, it can feel and sound extremely prescriptive, and that leads to someone acting relatively awkwardly. But my pushback to that is, that's fine, because this is just a drill. Like, when I think about workshops, I think about drills. Like, I used to be a runner, and when I would, in running and track and field, there are all of these there's drill like high knees or butt kickers, or just different drills that you do. And you do them not because you're actually going to run that way, but you do them because you're trying to train yourself a little bit on a very specific action or behavior. And so what these do, by breaking down these actions really discreetly, is you are trying to break down one specific action, one specific behavior that you want people to practice. And then as they get better at that, they can kind of forget, the actions just become a broader part of how they're behaving. It kind of levels up into an overall behavior. But you need to start by really closely defining the actions that you want them to take. And I'm not saying that these are all the actions to give better feedback. I don't think they are, but these are just examples of how closely you want to define them. And so, you're not all in probably looking to do training and better feedback, but where can you start if you're trying to think about, figure out, okay, what are the fundamental things that I need to focus on for leadership development? You start by asking questions like this, right? I think these two questions can actually get you a long way to identifying, okay, what are the actions that I need to be focusing on? First, just ask the question, who are the best leaders in my organization? And then what are the daily actions or habits that make them that way, right? That like make them that good. And I think it's important, this is another example of breaking away from reasoning by analogy to reasoning by first principles, because though there are fundamental leadership principles, don't get me wrong, there definitely are, how those manifest themselves in any organization is going to be different, right? If you're going to have your own type of culture, you're going to have the own way. Some organizations are much more they're much more pointed with one another. They speak much more plainly. They're much more focused on results, whereas others, maybe they hold back a little bit, or they're much more nuanced in their conversation. And so by focusing on the leaders in your organization and asking what are the daily actions or habits that make them great, that's how you can distill, okay, what does great leadership look like in my organization? And then how do I build training, build workshops that practice those fundamental actions, right? So the way this kind of, one example of how I've applied this or done with this is something that I call the Leadership Launchpad. It's just an example of a program that we're building right now. And this kind of came from me sitting back and saying, okay, if I think back about, I'm not internal to an organization anymore. So I had to kind of go broad and be like, okay, if I think back to the organizations that I have been a part of and the leaders that have really made an impact on my life, what do I think are the fundamental base things that someone needs to be able to do in order to be a good leader, at least a frontline leader? And for me, it came down to three basic things. First, they build trust, then they can give feedback, and then they can set goals. Those aren't necessarily actions, right? Those are still three relatively broad things. But then what we can do is we can take this idea of building trust. Okay, so building trust, that's a big picture behavior that we want to be able to put into our leaders. And you can ask the question, what does this look like in my organization? What are actions that somebody can take to help build trust in my organization? In this program, I just teach two basic actions. The first action is having daily, having everyday conversations with the team about non-work things, right? I think like in team meetings, very often we are in a world where we're so focused on results that we're trying to get, maximize every single second. And so team meetings is just sit down, okay, like what's on the agenda? What are the big taskers that we have going on? What are the blockers? You just dive right into it. Whereas I think most people have probably been on teams where you paused for a minute before you got into that. You took that first 5 minutes to just ask a simple question like, hey, how's everybody doing? Or what did you do this weekend? What's a book you've read recently? You come up with, you can ask any number of questions, but if you have every team meeting, take 5 minutes to talk about something real within the organization or within your team, then it allows your team members to connect as people rather than just coworkers. And so, it's an example of a very specific action that can help start building trust on the team. Another example of something that we do for building trust is something that I call the user manual for me, right? It's a basic, it's just a document where if you think about whenever you first start working for somebody, over the first 6 to 12 months of working with them, you learn a lot of things about them. You learn, how do they like feedback? Right? How do they like getting feedback? Do they, what's their preferred way of communicating? What's the best way to convince them of something? And so what a user manual for me is, you just take all that stuff that you would slowly learn over 6 to 12 months and just put it in a document that people can read. Right. And so it's just a series of like a dozen questions. The leader fills it out, the people on the team fill it out. And it's kind of like a team building event where you just fast forward those first few months so that everybody, as soon as they join the team, can get to know it. So again, those aren't like right answers for any organization, but just in my reflecting for this particular program, those are the two behaviors, the two actions that we teach within our workshops and practice within our workshops to help people somebody get better at building trust. Right. And then we do it again for giving feedback and setting goals. So again, just an example of, when we really step back, I think when we talk about first principles in leadership development, what does that really mean? The first step is get rid of the preconceived notions. It's not about what have you done before. It's not what have I liked before. You have to skip over that to ask the question of, what are the behaviors, what are the actions that make leaders great in my organization? Or you can, if you don't want to like focus on the great leaders, you can say, what are the actions or behaviors that people are missing in my organization? Or where is that behavior gap in my organization? And then you define that down to very discrete behaviors. And now it's easy. Now it's easy to build, a workshop and interaction, some kind of repetitive, something repetitious to help build in that behavior, right? So that's kind of the basic summary. That is the first principles design thinking applied to leadership development. If I can, I know, Chris, we're going to jump into a few questions. One thing I will say really quickly is if anybody wants to, I'm going to send an invite to another event that's kind of dives deeper into this specific topic, where it's only 30 minutes long, so it's not really diving deeper. But this is just a 30-minute session that's happening in about a week and a half. So it might not work. The time might not work for everybody, but we're going to dive into just one workshop for one specific behavior. I call it the leadership skill accelerator, where in 30 minutes, we just practice one skill, try to build that up. So if you can make it, cool. If not, I totally understand. It's been great kind of sharing some of these discussions with you. Chris, what have you got?
Well, I've got a lot of excitement first and foremost, and a lot of gratitude to you for raising these topics. And I see a lot of people in the chat also do confirm that they find this extremely inspiring and very helpful. And at the back of my mind, when I was listening to you, I was also thinking that we've just never been calling it this way. And in the community of intercultural communication, there is always this very same attitude, kind of just put away every expectations and prejudices that you have around the way the work should be done, and observe how you can all together create a better pattern to do these things. Yes. Now that you have a multicultural team, for example. So I think this very much resonates to many areas of life, not just the ones that you have given as examples. Right.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's right. It's just a different name, like I said from the beginning. I don't think this is necessarily anything groundbreakingly new. It's just maybe a slightly different way to think about it. And I think you're totally right. It can be applied to many different parts of learning, parts of life.
Totally. I do have a couple of comments though in the chat on YouTube. And I welcome heavily everyone to please use this opportunity to ask Matt the questions while he's still with us. And I'd like you, Matt, to please maybe react to those comments, because I'm sure you're going to bring in some helpful perspective here. So we've got two comments which are very interconnected, and I'll read them all together. So CJ was saying that a good coaching and relationships development is exactly what your approach is describing. And Christy was commenting as well that this is called counseling language, and we do use it in therapy sessions. When you were speaking about feedback, and when you were speaking about recognizing the comments that were said by an interlocutor. So maybe you want to relate to that.
No, I think that's definitely right. And the interesting thing, one of the most interesting things that I find out about first principles thinking is it allows someone without prior background in a subject, you can kind of like discover best practices almost without realizing it, where you didn't discover them, like they exist. So that's great to hear that that's an example of, if you really go back to the root of something and just kind of reason up from the thought of, I am a human, we are all humans, how do I want to be communicated with as a human? It makes sense that you would kind of wind up with these, this is what we tell counselors to do. Right. It makes sense.
Right, right. And there was another question from Veronica about a cost of the workshop that you were announcing. Would you like to say a few
Mm.
words about that?
Oh, this is totally free. So this
Okay.
is just I'm doing this for two different reasons. One is if you are a leader and you want to practice a skill, then that's great. But also for those of us in the learning field who are teaching others how to be better leaders, my hope is to give you some examples and ideas of workshops that you can include in your training sessions.
Right, so true. Just this is too good to be true. Such an amazing set of real helpful tools, and it's all for free. Okay, hard to believe, but this is what happens to you if you come to an iSpring conference, learning a
Exactly,
lot of
exactly.
helpful things. So we also have a discussion amongst the participants speaking about where counseling language comes from, instructional and pedagogy talks, and
Mm.
and it very much speaks to the strength-based approach. So I think Carmelita was pointing that out. So there, people are very excited about the upcoming workshop. So I'm sure you have a good number of audience coming from this conversation today, Matt.
That'll be great. Yeah, and I don't know if anybody can see it, but I have a strengths mug. That is my mug this morning. So yeah, I'm a big fan of the strengths based approach to stuff for sure.
Yeah. Um, I probably would ask you just one question on my own because I see there is a discussion, but there is no particular like question crystallizing in the chat. I will probably just ask you if, let's say, can you give any tip or maybe a quick comment on what if an organization wants to have like a bigger picture leadership development rather than just a specific tool that you're talking about? Would you maybe make a comment on that?
Yeah, and I think as I kind of mentioned earlier on, one of the biggest challenges that I think many of those of us in learning face is that we know what good learning will look like, or we think we know what good learning will look like, but it's very different from what our senior leaders think of as learning. They
Mm,
have this sense of things that have seen in the past, and
mm,
so there is a desire to have these 2-day offsites to talk about big picture stuff, and very often a first principles approach or an action based approach can seem too simplistic.
right.
And so I think the goal there is to start as small as possible and
Mm,
experiment,
mm,
because you can do these things if you focus down enough on one specific behavior. You can do these things. This workshop that I'm hosting in a week and a half is 30 minutes long,
mm,
right? It doesn't need to be a big thing. And so it's, even if your leadership is saying, no, we want the big stuff,
mm,
sometimes you just got to go with it and say, yes, okay, we're going to do this. But if you can slowly change the conversation by introducing some of these experimental sessions that you're not trying to launch to the whole company, you're not
right.
trying to take people's, half a day of their time, just do an hour session with 8 leaders or something and get feedback on it. I just think anytime you're trying to introduce any kind of change in your culture,
Mm,
it's great if you can go top down. That's amazing. If you're
mm.
trying to go bottom up, then you kind of have to go as start as small as possible to slowly curve things.
Right. And then this is how you launch big changes, right? If we use the
Exactly.
space language again through very small discoveries and very small steps. And that's fine. One step for a specific organization, maybe a big step for a team or a user or a partner, somebody in your team, right? All right, Matt, I'm looking forward to seeing you again very shortly during the panel talk that we'll have a roundtable conversation with the peers of yours, with experts in e-learning and AI. I'd just like to remind to all of our listeners that Matt is going to join this roundtable discussion. And so I'm not saying goodbye to you. I'm just saying see you soon. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm really excited for coming back in a little bit.
Yeah, me too. Thank you so much, Matt. I hope you can stay with us throughout this period of time before the roundtable and maybe also discuss those little questions that we have in the chat. I would call them little, but in fact, some of them are very big philosophical discussions that have been kickstarting in the chat. So please stay with us for a little longer and enjoy the speeches of the other experts and speakers. And of course, please support our conversation in the chat.